the Ayn Rand Center UK's YouTube channel, and the Daily Objective. We always bring you something unique, something special. We are the largest producer of objectivist-related content in the world at any time of history, and you're part of it by being part of our, as they say, philosophy posse. A big part of that posse is James Valliant, and he joins us today for the Daily Objective. James, thank you so much for being with us. James is an author, he's an objectivist scholar, and a lawyer as well, I believe. You're an attorney.
I am a trained attorney. I'm a historian and a huge advocate of Ayn Rand. Thank you, Jonathan. It's always a pleasure to join you.
Well, we got a great topic today, and we're welcoming not only our viewers in jolly old England. Did you know, James, it's also called the UK? It's interesting. I never really knew that. But all over the world, we really have a community of viewers, of listeners, of members of our channel. I see some of that discussion is already starting here, but we really need your super chats as well. So hit us up in the super chat, be part of our conversation. It really is so supportive of Razi and the professionals behind the scenes who make this happen. And we've got a great program for you today. I want to mention briefly some of James' books, Creating Christ, The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, and a photo that might be just a few years old, but I don't know, maybe not.
That cover for the audiobook, the hardcover has a different cover, but I got to mention the documentary on it will probably be coming out in the next couple of months, and so I'm very excited about developments on Creating Christ.
The new doc on Creating Christ. Awesome. We'll definitely talk about when that comes out. This is not a part of Objective. We're inspired by Objectivism, and we're encouraging always to read more Objectivism, read Ayn Rand's works, Dr. Peikoff's works as well.
Oh yeah, I am not Ayn Rand, I am not Leonard Peikoff, but I'm just an admiring student of both of them. That's the best I can say.
Well, and we all are, and we're always encouraged to define ourselves. We are students of Objectivism, and we're having that discussion. And you're so knowledgeable, James, that we're delighted to be having it with you today. So let's define some of these terms because we hear them bandied about so often now. You know, you're a fascist, or you're a communist. So this is so relevant now because Miss Rand defined these very explicitly and defining the need of definitions. She said in the Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, what is a definition? A definition is a statement that identifies the nature of the units subsumed under a concept. Let's get to it. We're going to talk about socialism and communism today, fascism and Nazism, and capitalism. Remember that little old chestnut? We're going to get to that as well, and kind of really explicitly get into that. We'll start with socialism and communism, then go into fascism, Nazism, and then hit capitalism. Are you ready? And thank you, Robert has already gotten the super chat kicked off. He says, he's quoting Ayn Rand now, the truth or falsehood of all of man's conclusions, inferences, thought, and knowledge rest on the truth or falsehood of his definitions. So thank you, Robert. Appreciate that. Appreciate the contribution. That's what we'll get to today. We'll start with socialism and communism. What's so interesting, James, is I know you've seen this as well. Both sides call each other all these terms. You've seen that.
Oh yeah. It's the typical mode today is to find a term that the majority of the public is turned off to, and to associate your opponent with that term.
Right.
It is part of the wider unfortunate thing here is that rather than discussing ideas, the content and meaning and definition of those ideas, rather than getting our principles and philosophy straight, what politicians unfortunately do these days is demonize one another. It's a personal attack. You're a no good Nazi. You're Adolf Hitler. You're a no good communist. You're Joseph Stalin. And that's really not very helpful, is it?
Well, and here in the top, we see, Republicans are communists, but here, Democrats like Blumenthal are the communists. Ayn Rand talked about this. One of her best essays, which is in the Ayn Rand column, and also a speech, which is on the Ayn Rand Institute website. She said, the main characteristic of socialism and of communism is public ownership of the means of production and therefore the abolition of private property. What's interesting about that, James, is you don't really hear that these days. I don't know a lot of political parties that are explicitly talking about the abolition of private property, right or left. Yet we hear this you're a communist, you're a socialist. But is it that the public today doesn't really understand what that is?
Well, that's it. They don't. Private property is not discussed. It used to be, of course, a staple in American education, a moral principle of the American government, private property. That was an essential part of individualism and freedom and rights as our framers conceived it. But today, private property is a dirty word in many quarters, both on the right and the left, but that doesn't quite yet make either of them either socialists or communists. Socialism is, however, obviously the central control of the economy by the government, and it is characterized by the public ownership of the means of production. There were the socialists before Karl Marx, and Christian socialists, socialists of other kinds, before Karl Marx. And they varied both in the degree of socialism that they wanted and the means by which we get to socialism. One of the great experiences of the 20th century was Great Britain, or you call it the United Kingdom. They, in the 1950s, embraced socialism and nationalized many, although not all industries, but most of the big industries were nationalized, but it was all done democratically. Some private property was still permitted. And so there you have a form of socialism in which there was a large degree still of free speech and civil liberties, in which private property was at least still permitted, and the socialism came about by purely democratic means. So socialism can vary in degree, socialism can vary in how you get there, but the thing that socialism and communism have in common is this public ownership of the means of production, the important property.
Yeah, I mean, Miss Rand seems to differentiate between, she puts socialism and communism on one axis and fascism and Nazism on the other. And think about the time when all this was being written. I mean, Nazism was kind of part of that. So she differentiates between that, but she says that the difference between those two axes, socialism, communism, and fascism, Nazism, quoting now, is superficial and purely formal, but it is significant psychologically. Socialism, communism brings the authoritarian nature of a planned economy crudely into the open. Now, is that because in socialism and communism, the idea is it's like, well, it's the public phone company, it's the public, everyone knows that these entities are owned and operated by the state.
Yes, that's exactly it. Adolf Hitler left, when he took over Germany in 1933, left the title to property, even to factories and the means of production, that sort of thing, formally. You know, they got that nice piece of paper, that deed, you still own this or something, that gives them formally title to property, but takes away all of the control. Nazism is a form of socialism. It is right. A form of socialism, just
and
like
all of this is collectivism. I think that's the thing that people always say, well, where's objectivism? And you're on the right or the left. And we always have to emphasize we're not on that spectrum. We are, we're individualists. We're not on a collectivist spectrum at all. And to me, I don't see fundamentally a big difference between Nazism, fascism, or socialism.
And that's the ridiculous false alternative we're given. And especially through the last 60, 70 years, you're either on the fascist wing or you're on the communist wing, and these are your choices. Or, to put it a little more gently, like politicians in Britain and the United States do, right? You're either on this nationalist, bigoted side, or you're on this, the socialist, let's help out the poor side, without, and this is the key, in their own minds, they may be confused. Those ideas may eventually lead us to totalitarianism, but they are not themselves advocates of totalitarianism. But it's this false alternative that we're being given, where capitalism is sort of wiped out before you even get there, before you even get in the door. It's defined out of existence as a possibility.
It's Miss Rand's title of the book, The Unknown Ideal. It's just unknown. It's not even on the landscape now. And thank you. You'll
hear the left say, well, fascism is capitalism. You'll hear the right, right say, in effect, their poor understanding of it, well, the only way to save us from communism is a whole bunch of socialism.
Right.
FDR saved capitalism, you see.
Or
John W. saved capitalism when they gave major expansions of the state. So what's strange is neither party really is identifying what's really going on. No one is worse in terms of getting us down a socialist path than the Republicans, because they're supposed to be the opposition. If someone says, hey, let's do socialism, and someone says, well, let's do socialism light, let's not do total outright socialism with healthcare, say, like Britain does. Let's just do it piecemeal. They have thrown in the towel on the very possibility of a free market right away. Boom.
And again,
out.
Same thing. See Conservatism and Obituary by Miss Rand to see the early stages of this. And thank you, Wes Stewart, super generous contribution. Wes says, I get to catch a stream with Hoenig and Valliant. Awesome. Which I say awesome to you, and thank you for being part of what we're doing here. It's really generous and much appreciated to help keep us going. Allie says, thanks for explaining the differences. It gets confusing, and it does get confusing. Well, let's talk about some of what Rand wrote about, kind of the ideas behind it, the psychology behind it. She said the socialist communist axis keeps promising to achieve abundance, material comfort, and security for its victims in some indeterminate future. It offers its victims an alleged social ideal, and it proclaims some grandiose economic plan which keeps receding year after year after year. Now, a lot of that comes to my mind in terms of what we see in today's politics. What say you?
Oh, yeah. See, one of the real problems that communists faced in the 1940s and 50s was the widespread recognition, the growing recognition that totalitarianism had failed. Between 1950 and 1970, there was a huge growing recognition that even democratic, moderate socialism in Great Britain had failed. And this failure to deliver the goods, which is exactly what the communists and socialists had promised, material abundance, technological progress. And of course, they failed to deliver, and they failed to deliver miserably year after year after year, which sort of took the wind out of their sails to some extent. Now,
Sweden too, I think you could put in that list as well. Sweden's
yes, exactly. Now, does that stop people from advocating socialism? Absolutely not. Not all advocates of socialism are full-on totalitarian communists. That's important to remember. But it's morality that really controls the debate, not these practical considerations. It may take the wind out of the sails to have socialism fail again and again and again, but somehow there's a group that's always doing it because morality trumps practicality every time, which is another indicator of the importance of philosophy. A crisis does not tell us how to react to it or how to understand it. Only philosophy can tell us how to react to any crisis.
Does this ring a bell at all? For example, with the environmentalist movement today, that it's offering this social ideal and this eventual abundance, this green energy abundance, and those economic plans, as Ms. Rand writes, keep receding year after year. I think about all those examples of we're supposed to be up to here in the seawater by now.
You're right.
To happen.
Well, they do have that same kind of unrealistic goal setting. On the other hand, the real difference between the socialist communist types who focused on the economic stuff, they kept promising that it would be better for the poor and that it would, as I say, they would deliver the material goods. They've sort of shifted, the left has sort of shifted its strategy. Instead of saying we'll deliver prosperity, they're saying we have to tighten our belts. We have to get on with less. We're the enemies. Fossil fuels and our petrol-driven vehicles are the problem. And so what they're trying to do is get us used to sacrifice and starvation. The Reds at least.
The altruism is more just on its face. It's more plain.
Well, that's it. The Reds at least were saying do it for the poor, as wrong as they were in their collectivism. The Greens are saying do it for the moss and the bracken and the insects. So, in one sense, they've had to pull back their claims of material prosperity as a tactical move, and I think that's one of the reasons that explains environmentalism. But just like communism, environmentalism is a kind of mysticism. It's an irrational, collectivist way of convincing people that there's something more important than their own actual, real individual lives.
I want to interrupt this slide to thank Phil, very generous contribution to the Ayn Rand Center UK. And I just want to say, it's those Super Chat contributions. We all donate our time. It's one gentleman, Razi, who keeps this whole ship running with brand new objectivist content day after day after day with people like James who are studied, who aren't just someone who, scholars. So Phil, thank you for that. 50 pounds. Phil said, I listened to Liz Truss's first speech in plenty as PM, a Parsons egg, I suggest, good in parts. Identifies with Maggie Thatcher. I don't think so, but we'll see. Same old, bollocks, probably. We need a republic and written constitution so much. Now, that's in some kind of a foreign language, Jim. Could you understand any of that? I'm joking. I know it's.
Yes. Well, Britain doesn't have a written constitution, and a written constitution in America, for all the philosophical corruption that America has endured over the last 150 years, nonetheless, the Constitution has, even through all that, provided some kind of check to protect individual liberty, at least to some degree, where the Supreme Court can knock down something that Congress or the president does. They don't have that in Great Britain. And the parliament is in effect an absolute dictator. It can do anything it wants. It could repeal its Bill of Rights tomorrow by an act of Congress. They do have a Supreme Court now, but they're just now developing their independent judiciary powers, but they have no written constitution to go by. So I understand the question from that angle, and I do agree with you. Great Britain needs a written constitution with rights in there, individual rights that the government, no majority, no House of Commons majority, however big, can violate. A system more like America's, which protects individual liberty as the primary moral value.
I'll just say, I mean, I think there's a great opportunity in Britain. I watch the markets all the time, and if Britain, now free from the European Union, can differentiate itself as a free market hub, as a trading hub, as a hub that's open for businesses, and Jim said individual rights. I mean, this could be, I don't know, the Hong Kong, if you will, of the next 15 or 20 years.
You're a dreamer, Jonathan.
We'll talk about now the second axis, if you will, the fascism, Nazism axis. And the same thing, it's like Biden got a lot of press, the last couple of weeks because he called Trump semi-fascist. But then, Jim, they went back and they saw all this video of Trump and Republicans calling the Democrats fascist, right? everyone's a fascist. Fascist.
Right. Democrats forever, like in the last slide, will point out how Republicans are compromising any free market principles they have. And of course, Republicans, the word fascist is probably a little less accurate than semi-fascist. I'll give Biden this in using semi-fascist. It was a little more fair because in my view, both sides, without knowing it, are heading us in a fascist direction. Yeah. Both sides, without knowing us, are. And so if
Rand called Kennedy fascist, right? She called a lot of Jonathan.
Yeah.
And well, let's define this, because I think you're right. I mean, seems like it's much more de rigueur now on every side of the aisle. Miss Rand writes, under fascism, men retain the semblance or pretense of private property, but the government holds total power over its use and disposal. Under fascism, citizens retain the responsibilities of owning property without freedom to act and without any of the advantages of ownership. So as you said, they have a piece of paper that says, I'm the owner, but regulation or whatever pretense, government can do whatever it wants, including just take it.
Yeah, some of these businessmen under Mussolini and Hitler actually went to jail for violating government dictates over how to control their own property, make a business decision or something. And so, it was kind of economy where a businessman could go to jail for making the wrong business decision, even though they retained some formal property title.
Well, I mean, this might be a question more for Shoshana, but was Miss Rand's father's store and property taken during the revolution?
Stolen. He was
that's what I'm saying.
Self-made man who grew up in the Russian Pale, where the Jews were forced to live. He was, and he only could get into university to become a pharmacist because the quotas for Jews in university only permitted so many openings. He had to go into chemistry. He got a degree in chemistry. He then was a totally self-made, successful small businessman. He had a shop in one of the main squares in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he had a thriving and successful pharmacy business. And that business was stolen by the Bolsheviks. And in effect, the Bolsheviks expected the family to starve. They were bourgeoisie, you see. They were the hated class. The middle class, the self-made middle class, was hated above all else. And so Rand's family suffered greatly. They nearly starved to death when the communists stole that man's work of a lifetime.
Here's what Rand wrote more about kind of getting behind that fascist ideology. The fascist Nazi axis scorns material comfort and security and keeps extolling some undefined sort of spiritual duty, service, and conquest. ringing a lot of bells these days, a duty, for the nation, the fascist Nazi axis offers nothing but loose talk about some unspecified form of racial or national greatness. Hear that a lot these days, right? Oh, you're insulting your people. Oh, you're a shame to your skin color, or whatever that bullshit is. I mean, and here's one that made me think, frankly, of perhaps Trump. The fascist Nazi axis merely extols leadership without purpose, program, or direction, and power for power's sake. That's today. That's politics today.
Talk about putting your finger right on it. Once more, the prescience of Ayn Rand. Isn't that, I mean, again, I see the direction of both sides leading us into a more socialist, even a more fascist direction. Calling them semi-fascist is a little more fair, it seems to me, than outright calling them totalitarians, which I don't think most are. I think we have to distinguish between at least a good chunk of Trump voters and a good chunk of Biden voters from Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. I don't think that's fair to the American people. But that is exactly what went down. I mean, you see Trump emphasizing this sort of nationalist axis, and he's happy to step away from free market principles and impose tariffs even on our allies. So out goes the window any concept of free trade. So it's not a principle of capitalism or freedom that he's standing for. It's his personal magnetism. It's his personal leadership role, because he's going to make our nation great again. MAGA, make America great again. It does sound like it's moving in the direction of fascism. And when Trump first came into office, that was my complaint. Not that he was an outright totalitarian or could get us there in the next 4 years, but man, we've taken a step in that direction. So in that sense, I absolutely agree. Now, the race stuff, that's even shared by the left. The left is becoming overtly racist now. And when you combine that with their environmentalism, they too have moved in the direction of a much more fascist direction. On the other hand, I wouldn't call either of them yet outright communists or fascists. Those are people who advocate real totalitarianism. And it's just kind of smearing. It's connected to what Ayn Rand said about extremism. Extremism, well, it doesn't matter what side or who's extreme. Extremism bad. Well, that's such a package deal, anti-concept, meaningless, useless. All you're saying, I mean, don't you want to be extremely happy? Don't you want to be extremely free and prosperous? Don't you want to be, so certain streams are great. So the idea that being, quote, an extremist in itself is bad, you see, is sort of the smear without really needing to define. You're so far socialist, you're a communist. You're so far nationalist, you're a Nazi. And that's what we're hearing.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. It's that the terms lose any meaning at all. And it means nothing ultimately. Well, let's finish with what Ms. Rand said, kind of now comparing, in either case, socialism or fascism. And this kind of hopefully getting to our point about these are both forms of altruism and collectivism. The government officials hold the economic, political, and legal power of life and death over the citizens. Under both systems, sacrifice is invoked as a magic, omnipotent solution to any crisis, and the public good is the altar on which victims are immolated. I mean, that is today. Politicians today explicitly, oh, this is for the public good.
Let's just take COVID. The same kind of intense fear and guilt that got Germans to vote so widely for Adolf Hitler in 1933 can almost be felt in the COVID lockdowns. They use guilt. If you go out there without your mask or without your mandatory vaccine or whatever, you are killing people. You're killing people. Stay at home, close your business, take our government handout checks, right? Fear, terrify. You're going to kill grandma. They do this. They whether the crisis is real, and Germany was certainly facing real crises in the 1930s, or the crisis is partial. We had a real COVID issue, but did the government jump to a totalitarian solution? I mean, in California and Great Britain, we were basically under house arrest. But how do they do that? Fear and guilt. And the opposite of fear and guilt is a rational definition of the ideas, knowing what we're talking about, making these critical distinctions, precisely what they don't want us to have. It's like the governor of New Jersey when the COVID lockdowns happened. They said, well, don't some of these COVID restrictions violate the Constitution? And he said, the governor of New Jersey said the Constitution is, quote, above my pay grade. I don't see any disease exception in the Constitution. And this was simply their fear and guilt, just like dictators.
Well, I mean, what politician even mentions the Constitution? It's not even brought up. There's no sense of limit at all. You can,
right.
It's one of my books and Miss Rand's influences. Let's thank Roland. He says, great show as always with James. And I agree. James is so knowledgeable, such an asset. And it's your donations, Roland, and others who allow us to bring them to you. Allie says, would y'all consider doing a daily objective on what would an objectivist constitution would look like? It would be cool to see, especially after this episode. I've heard this over the years quite often, Jim, and what's your 10-second take?
There are objectivist lawyers and philosophers, Andrew Bernstein, I could name a couple of others, who have in fact suggested that we do just that. Ayn Rand understood that there were some major contradictions to the original Constitution, those that, for example, permitted slavery to exist in southern states and that sort of thing. That would be a great idea for a show. Again, wouldn't be objectivism, but sort of applied objectivism in the field of legal and constitutional philosophy of law. But it would be a very worthy exercise.
It seems like, as always, like a bit of a attempted, Allie, with all respect, a shortcut. It's like, if we just had a better constitution, but isn't it that we need the ideas because to get there to the Constitution, we need people to believe in some of those ideas, even a little bit of them.
I sure the hell tell you, I would not advocate a constitutional convention today. I would be terrified at the damage they would do to the original and what
That's
all
exactly right.
So and besides, as you point out, no constitution can protect us at the end of the day. It may be able to slow the progress toward more and more centralized government power as it has in America. But unless people understand it, notice how the Supreme Court, and even in popular imagination, entire sections of the Constitution have in effect been written out and are no longer meaningful. So we no longer have as much freedom when it comes to economic matters. We don't have as clear a understanding of property rights as we once did in America. And that's going by the wayside. Absolutely. Because guess what? Even a constitution that protects your right to property is no defense at the end of the day if philosophy is corrupting everyone's understanding of that constitution and morality.
Let's do capitalism, because that, it's not even often on the horizon now. It's certainly not advocated by any political parties in the US. Ironically, it seems like, famously Elizabeth Warren, who's a real leftist here in America, she says, well, she's a capitalist to her bones. She's trying to kind of say, oh, I'm not so radical. I'm a capitalist just like you. And at the same time, the right is who does not advocate for capitalist positions. I don't think really any. That they are associated as being, here's Trump and his allies. So
I'm sorry, I just have to say here, Trump committed to capitalism is kind of a joke to me. His domestic spending outpaced Obama's even before COVID. He was advocating tariffs and, like I say, an end to free trade, even with our allies. So the idea that Donald Trump is some kind of advocate of individual rights and the free market is absolutely a joke. The Republican Party was already just a pathetic lip service for free market at best, and he has even removed most of that lip service, frankly. So to
I'll throw in one more. Remember when he would call up the CEOs of companies, Ford, I believe, and some other shake them down a little bit.
Private business owners, or jawboning the Fed to keep the interest rates low and the money flowing. I would remind everyone that the COVID lockdowns and all this government spending that was the result of that began under Trump. It was in 2020 where the government debt went through the roof because they were paying people to stay at home, close their businesses, and they were just sending out checks. More government borrowing, more Fed printing. And it started under Trump. So everyone says, "Oh, inflation, Biden." I do not.
It's true.
I do not doubt that the spending under Biden, but it started under Trump.
The whole PPP thing, which is basically like taking all that wealth and just setting it on fire, in my opinion.
Exactly.
The airline bailouts, all that. It's a good point.
All that.
Rand defined capitalism. like Elizabeth Warren and the rest, she defined it. And, it's not even, people say, oh, capitalism making money. But Jim, she defines it as a society in which no man or group may initiate the use of physical force against others. That's kind of a unique, people wouldn't necessarily think about that when they say, oh, I'm a capitalist. What does that have to do with physical force? They think, oh, I just want to make money. But help for our audience understand a bit about what does that mean in terms of capitalism? How does capitalism and physical force go together at all?
Well, all rights, your rights are a unity. You can't violate economic rights without violating civil rights. They're really the same thing. And Ayn Rand advocated a separation of economics and state for the same reason she advocated a separation of church and state, ideology from state. Freedom is the protection, a system that protects individual rights. Capitalism is the only system that protects individual rights, all individual rights, both personal and economic freedom. And so you'd have to define capitalism, as Ayn Rand does, as the system that defends individual rights, including property rights, in which property is all privately owned. That is the unknown ideal that's out there, because neither side even advocates that. The left will accuse the most atrocious anarchist, the tribal warfare, third world country as capitalism. See, there's your freedom working. See, that's freedom. See, capitalism working. Of course, they have no idea that it actually requires freedom. And that requires a government. And that requires rule of law. One of the preconditions of a free market is that freedom bit. And if government isn't there to exclude physical force, physical coercion, and guarantee that all human interaction is voluntary, which is the essence of the protection of individual rights, then you're on the road, let me put it this way, to some kind of fascism for sure, because you've now departed. And it's a false alternative, this fascism versus communism thing. They're both totalitarians. They both want to take over the economy. And by saying that's the false alternative, they exclude this possibility of individual freedom, which frankly, to the degree that any country in human history has experienced individual freedom, is precisely the degree to which humans have been prosperous. And progress has actually occurred, and only to that degree.
That's what's so frightening. I'll just quickly say, and I want to get to more super chats as well. Quickly say, that's what's so frightening now, I feel like, in the American political discourse, is that capitalism is not even on the table. So something like healthcare, for example, both sides or all sides are wondering, well, how do we regulate healthcare? How do we provide healthcare for the people? But there's no voice of how do we privatize healthcare, the post office, any other sectors of the economy which are so dominated by government.
Donald Trump and Senator McConnell, from the very beginning of the Trump administration, said, oh, it's our goal to provide every American with affordable health care, as if it were the federal government's obligation. And the tax
manufacturing jobs, we're going to have certain kind of jobs.
Oh, right. Total industrial policy nonsense. Yeah. No, to accuse it's so funny, it's so ironic to accuse Republicans of being so committed to capitalism is a joke, because Republicans are, through the course of my lifetime, have lost even the lip service defense of capitalism under Trump.
There even were, I mean, I think at some point, I'm sure you know, Miss Rand said something effective like, oftentimes the capitalists are the worst defenders of capitalism, or maybe it was the conservatives, but you'd rather they just not.
I think the line you're looking for is, if an idea is really bad, it probably comes from really awful, it comes from the Democrats. If it is god awful, it comes from the Republicans. That's it. She also said, if anyone will destroy this country, it's the conservatives, it's the Republicans, because they don't know how to defend America's founders and capitalism. They wouldn't know a principle if it bit them in the butt.
Wes wants to know your opinion on a parliamentary system like in the UK versus the US system.
I much prefer the US system. We are far less direct democracy. House of Commons is in effect the uncontrollable, unlimited dictator of the United Kingdom. And if you can get something through the House of Commons, nothing else matters. And the members are voted straight in. America has a much more complex and difficult system even for making laws. We have a Senate, which is totally undemocratic, right? Wyoming has 2 senators and 1 member of the House because its population is so small. But each state, regardless of population, gets 2 senators. Well, that's undemocratic. The Electoral College is undemocratic. The filibuster in the Senate is undemocratic. So as we have all these Democrats saying that we're defending democracy and Donald Trump and these MAGA Republicans are a threat to democratic institutions, well, they're the ones advocating packing the Supreme Court, getting rid of the filibuster, undoing the Electoral College. They're the ones who are directly criticizing American institutions that protect us. But it's those institutions that are built into both our Constitution and into our traditions. The filibuster isn't in the Constitution, but it's part of our traditions. That's meant to be a brake on democracy. That's meant to be a slow down, people, until you really know you want to pass this law. And then we have this Supreme Court and these individual rights, so that even if you can get it through the Senate in this slow, undemocratic process, then the Supreme Court can say, hey, that doesn't meet the Constitution's requirements. It's out. I don't care how difficult it was to get through Congress. But I much prefer America's system of checks and balances, division of power. You see, once upon a time, Congress, or the House of Commons, could act like a court and convict people, pass a law that says, you, Jonathan, go to jail. A law that says you go. So they've usurped judicial authority and they've usurped both legislative and executive authority. The prime minister and his cabinet are chosen from the majority parliament and parliament. And
you know, if that ever happens to me, my response is to go, order, order.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm seeing great conversation from so many of our members on YouTube. You know, I think it only costs £3 or £4 a month. Joey Spinoza, Allie's getting into it. Robert's getting into it. So thanks all for keeping that conversation going as well. Jim, you know, all those other systems, the collectivist systems, about sacrifice to the group, to the environments, but capitalism, as Rand writes, that this is from the Voice of Reason, it's very much just the opposite. Capitalism, quoting now, does not tell men to suffer, but to pursue enjoyment and achievement here on earth. Capitalism does not tell man to serve and sacrifice, but to produce and profit. Capitalism does not preach passivity, humility, resignation, but independence, self-confidence, self-reliance, and above all, capitalism does not permit anyone to expect or demand to take or to give the unearned. About as explicit as you get.
What can you say to that? But that's exactly it. All forms of collectivism have always relied for their philosophical base on altruism. You really exist to serve others, and you are in effect a slave, whether morally or politically, and they'll vary on this to various degrees. But the altruist will say that you basically have to live for others, just as others have to live for you and everyone else, which sort of puts me in some giant public cesspool where I'm never really. So the collectivism says that the individual is not the important unit. They're not the thinker. They're not the producer. They're not the consumer. They are the individual is sort of removed from consideration. The collective is all. And if we have to sacrifice every little individual, we'll do it to get this mystical collective. So altruism is typically based on some form of mysticism, whether it's traditional Christianity or communism, which is also another form of mysticism that justifies an altruism of this doctrine of self-sacrifice, this doctrine. And we hear that doctrine from ordinary American politicians who are not totalitarians. John McCain, you've got to live for something greater than yourself.
Country first.
Country first. Exactly. Exactly. Look, if I didn't live in a country that mostly protected my rights, I would have no interest in defending it. Why should I? I wouldn't have gone out and defended Nazi Germany. I would have been part of the resistance if I could be, right?
Well, one phrase I like as we kind of close out the program here today is, and I believe Ms. Rand referred to herself as a radical for capitalism. And
well, if you're a radical for freedom and happiness and prosperity, if you're a radical for the actual civilization and progress of humanity, obviously, what we need is, by radical, she means fundamental, principled, thoughtful, rational, and that means consistency. So radical, fundamental, consistent, yes, but for freedom, for prosperity, for human success. That's the kind of extremism we need to embrace. And just personality smearing is not going to either be helpful or advance the debate as it needs to be.
Thank you, James, as always, for sharing your wisdom with us today. Thanks to our super chats, our members, mostly to our members for that very small monthly contribution. We so appreciate it. It helps us bring you this original programming Monday through Friday. So subscribe, share with a friend. See us back here tomorrow. On behalf of James Valliant and the staff here, massive staff. You guys all right? Yeah, good. All right. Everyone's good. We wish you all best premises and be well.
Take care.